Welcome to the Parish the Thought Show. The opinions of Brian, your host, and his guests have not been sanitized or scientifically tested, so please consume at your own risk. Now, here's Brian.
Ladies and gentlemen, and whoever else is listening, welcome back to the program. My guest today is Phelosha Collaros. We just talked about this, and I'm slaughtering it.
It's all right, Collaros. You're good.
The founder of Depolarize. And just jump right in and tell me what Depolarize is, and then we'll talk about why you're here and how we all connected.
Absolutely. So depolarized.com is a site that I launched early this year. Basically, that is to fill a need that I think is really encapsulated by the Webster Merriam Word of the Year. Did you see the announcement of what Merriam-Webster chose as the 2024 Word of the Year?
No, but I think it's polarization.
It's polarization. Okay. Exactly. And you know, when I was telling people about my TED Talk a couple years ago, what I found was that people had a gut feeling that things were going sideways, but they didn't know what to call it. They didn't know what to name it, and they didn't know what exactly was happening. And when I would tell my story, which we'll talk about today, there was that real gap of like, what is it? What's happening? How do we name it? And then once we name it, how do we learn more about it? And that was really what lit my passion to found depolarized.com. It's a site that's specifically created so folks can learn what polarization is, but also learn what the solutions to that are. And it has a real philosophy to reach out to people in where they're going to be best fitted to receive information, right? So we highlight different podcasts like what we're doing right now. So if you're an audio learner, that's there for you. Lots of different books, news and commentary from sides that kind of look at the sides and also bring them together and analyze them, research about polarization. We also have different organizations people can join to get involved in how to decrease the facets of polarization, and just, you know, fun stuff to explore, because we want this to be accessible. You know, when I saw the announcement of the 2024 Word of the Year being polarization, I thought, you know, people are literally searching, because that's how they choose the word. What are the most searches that they're seeing on their website? People are searching to find out what is happening to this country and what's happening around the world. And there is that hunger to understand what we're going through as a nation. And I think that having accessible, you know, friendly ways to engage in this topic, it doesn't have to be something you're afraid of. It can be something you can engage in and do something about. That was really important to me. And that's where depolarized.com came from.
And so absolutely needed right now, because it is a mess. And sometimes I wonder, is it a mess because I'm searching for the mess, or is it as bad as we think it is? I don't know. Maybe I don't. That's not.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And so in my hunger to understand, right? So one of the things I'll say about polarization and the way Merriam-Webster tries to help us understand it is, you know, we're going to have typically what you see in any civilization at any period in time is it's kind of a continuity of different beliefs, opinions, and perspectives, right? They're on a continuum. When a society starts to get polarized, you're going to see that continuum collapse to two different extremes, right? That feel in conflict or in combat with each other in a way that is intense, very intensified, and very vitriolic. And so that collapsing to the two sides, I think that this has reached kind of a pitch here in America that we didn't see before. There's always been conflict, but there's always been continuity in that conflict. I think it's the kind of pulling aside to these two extremes that is new for us, that people are searching, they're seeing, and they're trying to understand. And that is something that has been seen in other societies before. Now, back to your question about, is it real, or is it real? Is it new? Is it imagined? There's really great research around two different types of polarization. One being political polarization, and the other being affective polarization, right? So political polarization, kind of having different opinions on policy matters. Again, that's how it should be. We're not a monolithic society. We shouldn't be. We should have people who have different policy positions and are passionate about those policy positions. And so what we first saw was that people were much less polarized politically than their leaders were. And when you think about the kind of marketing communications that it takes to be a successful politician in this country, and the kind of call to differentiate yourself, that starts to make some sense, right? So that you're going to be more extreme than your base to differentiate yourself and say, I really believe in this. I really am against that. But when you look at actual policy numbers, so when they do polling around, let's pick a couple of examples. When they do polling around gun control, for example, or they do polling around abortion, or they do polling around voting rights and access, Americans broadly are more similar than we're led to believe by our politicians. We seem to be kind of a practical society, right? That wants common sense center views, right? So people do believe, the majority of Americans believe in the right to bear arms. The majority of Americans also believe in some limitations around having assault rifles. So we see this kind of policy centricity for the most part in our society, but the politicians do not reflect that, right? So the politicians are kind of pulling us to differentiate their positions to the extremes. If we just had political polarization, I think we wouldn't be feeling the anxiety that we're feeling right now, which is the effective polarization. So as this pulling apart continues to happen, and we'll talk about some other factors that make it worse, effective polarization is when people start to see the other side, not just as different in policy solutions, but as different in the dignity of their humanity, right? So the other side now becomes evil, untrustworthy, wanting to ruin the country. The other side becomes something that is dangerous to you, right? That kind of effective polarization, that feels newer. And that, I think, is really what's different and maybe what's more destructive than the political polarization that we've seen.
And it's so subtle that we can hardly recognize it. I mean, I spent 20 years hard conservative, fearing and hating anything from the quote unquote other side, and didn't even realize it. Mm-hmm. And it's by design. Those who I think are in power, if they can keep us fighting, then we have the common enemy, then they can keep stirring it and we'll keep going and not seeing what they're really doing.
Absolutely.
Scary. It's a scary time.
I think so there's probably three things that I would point to that are similar to where I started my research in this area, right? So I'll say first that this was a personal story, a personal journey before it was more of a research journey, and it was because we'll talk about 2014 because I think it's so pivotal, like 10 years ago. So here we are in 2024, the word of the year is polarization. But when we look at 2014, there were some markers that really were going to kind of pave the way of how we got to today. And that was when my mother, who is a Colombian born American citizen now, started to talk about a hidden heritage that we didn't know about in our family. So she, for the first time, so I'm, been living for 40 plus years on this planet with her, she never mentioned that our grandparents in Colombia were in a mixed political marriage. So it was a conservadora and a liberal, and they were living in a time in Colombia where the partisan effective polarization was so bad that they struggled to keep their family safe and actually had to move from town to town to town because towns were either liberal or they were conservative. And if they were in a conservative town, one of them wasn't safe. If they were in a liberal town, one of them wasn't safe. And so it got so partisan in that country that ultimately 200,000 people were killed and Bogota burned. She had never talked about this side of our heritage before 2014. And when she started talking about it, I think it was because she was starting to worry. She was seeing very similar markers in this country that she remembered from her own country. And so that's why I'll draw out three things that I think the first one gets dead at what you were talking about with, this engine that's trying to move along this political and in this effective polarization. The first is conflict entrepreneurs. So like I'm going to say, follow the money, right? People are making money off of this type of fraction in our country. And that is kind of has a life of its own when you start to economically reward and reward with power and attention the people that are driving this polarization. Conflict entrepreneurs in Colombia, so we're talking the late 20s to the late 40s, what you were talking about there was newspapers, radios, and radio hosts and shows, and then politicians who were kind of trying to advance themselves from like a local scene to a national scene, right? So that the media and the politicians are grasping onto this narrative, and the people are rewarding them for that kind of fight by giving them more power, by electing them, by promoting them, by buying the newspapers, by tuning into the radio shows. And you had, at that era, we're new to this, but in that era in Colombia, completely partisan news sources. So you would listen or read a completely different set of facts, and it allowed a narrative to emerge that really told you that the other side was dangerous to you. And in Colombia, saying there are conservatives in this area killing liberals, or there are liberals in this area killing conservatives, became a threat to life to people. And they were only consuming that side of the narrative. So that's the first thing. I think conflict entrepreneurs are a huge part of what drives that type of polarization, the dangerous polarization, and certainly something that we've been seeing emerge since 2014.
I'm the one that can protect you from those people, that side, that menace. It's a powerful, powerful thing.
Exactly. And who doesn't want to feel safe, right? I mean, that is a rational feeling. The question is when fear turns into some type of asset, whether that asset is monetary or whether that asset is political power, we have to explore the incentives of what people are telling us and how they're trying to kind of stir up folks, against each other. I think number two, after the conflict entrepreneurs, really is this lack of faith in institutions anymore, right? So I'm gonna just kind of point to 5 things that happened in 2014. You'll have to tell me if I missed anything or if any of these resonate with you. But we're seeing this crystallization in 2014 of the kind of societal issues being turned into these really public wars through our media. And one of them, of course, was same-sex marriage. So that was in the courts all through 2014 in a very big way. People taking sides about that. The courts weighing in, different states having different relationships to that happening. So that was huge. We also had in Washington all of the debates about the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, right? So that's kind of the national context there with what we're hearing in the media. These two kind of polarizing fights are happening. Then, you see Las Vegas, you have a couple who kills 2 police officers, a bystander, and then themselves. And this is kind of this first percolating issue of people say, oh, their goal was they wanted to start a revolution. They're affiliated with militias. They're affiliated with supremacy movements. And so you start to hear like, oh, there's some serious factions out there that are taking matters into their own hands. In my hometown of Albuquerque, in 2014, we actually had a homeless person killed by police that drove hundreds of protesters out on the street. Protesters that then became violent to some extent, that stayed. They actually captured a police substation. And Anonymous, who you'll remember was kind of huge at that time, attacked our police servers at the same time to try to, as punishment for the killing of this mentally ill individual. And then you see this later in the year that you have Eric Garner and you have Michael Brown, not their police officers who kills them not being convicted. You have the protests and then the riots that happened in Ferguson. So we're starting to see this really clear issue of, we can't kind of resolve these societal issues at the top. We can't trust our institutions or our police to keep us safe. That we can't trust our judicial system to hand out justice. And then at the same time as this is happening, you have this emergence of social media. So 2014 is actually called the year that made social media, right? If you look at that. And that I think is kind of twofold. One, you have a lot of people finally figuring out how to monetize it in a really serious way, right? So folks are finally getting a lot of cash from their social media presence and going viral. But two, you also see this real rise in the phenomenon of online subcultures that are turning political, and also online harassment that is to a level we'd never seen before. So Gamergate is also in 2014. So you have these two kind of the institutions being pulled down and the faith of institutions being pulled down, and the rise of the social media that's right at this nexus of what is happening with the disintegration of the institutions and kind of creating its own institution of faction and echo chambers at the same time. So I think when, we'll go back personally to my story, my mother is seeing this and she's saying, okay, we've got the conflict of entrepreneurs, no question. We've got the lack of faith in our institutions is really starting to be very present, right? And then we have this kind of societal faction and this polarization and people taking into these camps of taking things into their own hands and saying how they're going to actually, in some cases, be violent. That was a recipe that she'd seen before.
What I've also noticed is people will see things at a headline level and just run with it. It doesn't appear that people are doing any amount of homework at all anymore to find out. I've got some kids that are very politically active, but they don't do a ton of research. And I always say, is it possible there is another angle to that before you do whatever you're going to do with it? At least look. There might be. Because
right.
Trust in institutions. I don't trust media, any media, because they're business. And I always tell people we have to at least, I think, agree on that.
Right.
Because we'll fight to the death in our social chambers for our side. And I ask people, how do you know what they're telling you is right? You believe it because you want to.
Absolutely.
But how do you know? How do we know? How do any of us know? And Julie called me on that when I was on her, her show, because I said, I don't trust anything. And she helped me change my thinking a little, because I don't like not trusting. We don't like not trusting. That's a horrible way to live when you just don't trust anything or anyone, because you're not going to talk to anyone. The dialogue is gone.
No, I mean, I think that's just a core issue of our age, right? Because where has this kind of delivered us at the end of the day here is we don't trust elections anymore, right? So you see that in Colombia too, is like when the faith of elections goes by the wayside, then what is the point to not kind of engage on the street in terms of trying to create the society you want? You have to believe in the voting booths and you have to believe in elections to some extent in order for it to be a functioning democracy.
And we want to be heard. And when we're not heard, I think that's why people do extreme things, because they just want to be acknowledged for their existence or their idea.
Absolutely.
Touch on, and maybe you were going down this road, the Colombia story, because as extreme as that was, it didn't start extreme. Nothing starts extreme in history.
Absolutely.
It's always subtle. As they say, Satan isn't going to come onto your doorstep and knock on your door and say, I'm here to destroy you, because you would shut the door and say, no way. Go away. But it's subtle.
Yes. No, it's the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Is that the? Yeah, and I think people are very well intentioned. I mean, I don't think anybody wakes up or enculturates their children in a political ideology or in a religious ideology, I think, to be evil. Right? We all come from a background of experiences and family legacies and histories that inform how we see the world, and we pass it along. And we do, especially now the day and age in social media. But even then, Colombia is a place where it was very hard to get from place to place, because there's 3 Andean mountain chains, right? So that geographically breaks people up. If you're talking about, the 20s to the 40s, not a lot of great roads, you have the rail system, but folks are kind of isolated, right? So it's not that unusual for there to be communities that maybe, have a culture in different areas of the country. And Colombia is very interesting in terms of, I think it has a lot of similarities to the founding of this country, the philosophy of its founders, how they took inspiration from the Enlightenment era in France, how the Colombia's founders took inspiration from America as well. And so there was a real, in seeking independence, a real hope for a broad-based democracy. And also what you see in this country too, of at the very bottom, always a tension between a more conservative mindset and a more liberal mindset, right? So that is very similar. And I will say that Colombia was also at that point in time before La Violencia, which is what happens with the partisan war, becomes so extreme. It was actually called the Athens of South America. So it was a very established democracy. There was a lot of pride in the institutions in that country and in how it was able to be a functional government. Even though it had what we would call here the Democratic and Republican parties, there it was just called the liberal and conservative parties, basically. It had that tension, but it was functional. So when you try to think like, how does something go from being the Athens of South America to having just riots and murders on the street and people not being able to live in certain towns, being exited? My mother, one of my mother's earliest memories is folks shooting at her house because her father was a liberal and they were in a conservative town at that time. So how does this break down to a level of that? And again, I think it is this, we talked about the trifecta, that recipe, the fear of the danger actually turns into a mindset of self-defense. So were there legitimate fears? Absolutely. I mean, were there folks that were, attacking people at the polls? This actually happened there, right? There were polls where folks were attacked if they weren't at the certain party and they were coming from a different area to vote. There were attacks at the polls. So things happened that were real. And then those were exploited by conflict entrepreneurs to create a whole climate of fear. And that climate of fear made people feel like they needed to be proactive in the polarization as opposed to reactive. Ultimately, I think what took the lid off, because the violence in the rural areas where institutions were the weakest was actually the highest. But what took the lid off of it was actually a political candidate was assassinated. That was very beloved by the liberals of the country. And when that assassination happened, I think that the final feelings that institutions could solve the problems of the country, like the disparity between the rich and the poor, evaporated because they didn't see a political solution anymore to the very real problems that the country was having. I feel that that's kind of reflective to where we are too. Can we see a political path to our solutions as a country? Can we invest institutions or the government in enough authority to, or just, have faith or do it as our citizens in our community? Can we see ways to act to get to the solutions we need to that are within the framework we have? Or are we going to go down the road of abandoning that framework? And I think that's a big question for me because we see the results in history and in other places too. I think Colombia is a very interesting example because unlike other places where we can dismiss that there was, the war was two religious factions or ethnic factions. In Colombia, it was primarily two political parties, very similar to our own.
Which is almost a religion. I would say it is another religion, really.
I think that's absolutely right.
The passion that it incites in people. I think politics is it fires people up way more than religion does anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think. I mean, I think part of that is, and we see this statistically, like our participation in religious institutions has really gone down over the past decades. Our participation in other activities like, even community-based activities has gone down. So where are we putting that need for connection and that need for feeling like you're doing something? I feel like there's kind of two places where we're putting that in the politics and the social media, which is very much tied to our politics.
Social media, that's our quote unquote connection designed to help us communicate better. And it's not, I guess it can in some instances. I can't just, broad brush it, but we don't communicate well.
I think it's back to what you were saying earlier about how easy it is to go into these silos, right? So social media just allows us to retreat in people that think like us. And if we're looking for solutions, like, you're speaking about in the media of like doing research, finding sources that disagree with us or trying to find a different perspective. At this point, social media doesn't help us seek out people who are different than us, right? Because that's not what the algorithm is meant to do.
I have a theory. I want an anti-algorithm that does the exact opposite. So if I search something, if I search Trump, it will give me complete opposite, and I shouldn't be threatened by that. I should want to learn, but it doesn't, because it doesn't make money.
It doesn't make money.
No, it's not going to make money.
Yeah.
I've been trying to do like have my brother be on my show or be like a co-host with me, and he said nobody's going to listen to us because we're getting along. We're trying to solve things. Nobody's going to. That's not sexy. And he's right, really.
No, it's so true. Listen? It is. It's funny. It's, you brought up Julie Rose. I thought one of the really interesting things she said in the podcast was that, media as fundamental bias is toward the narrative of conflict and crisis, because stories that are interesting have conflict. They have crisis. Like that's what is interesting. And that's not just I think a media problem. That's just a fundamental human interest, right? We want to hear something that has a bit of conflict, a bit of surprise. Where is this going? We're trying to figure it out as it goes along. There's a fight here happening, or there's at least, something that we want to see the outcome of, right? We're looking for this outcome. That's not obvious because two people aren't on the same side. They aren't communicating well. Every story, there's going to be, rom-coms, they're just not getting along. They're just not. So I think we have brain science is not on our side when we talk about depolarization. For a couple of reasons, right? Because narratives that are interesting to us are conflict narratives. And also because we do get dopamine hits from affirmation bias, right? When we have things that come to us and say, oh, you were right, our brain is excited about that. It is validating that. So how do we create a context where people say, you know what, I'm actually going to step through to the other side of that brain science and make myself uncomfortable and pursue an opposite perspective and not be validated and seek people that are working toward positive change? Like, how do we motivate that? I think that's just it's a fascinating question.
And like say, speaking of Julie Rose and her show Uncomfy, I hope that blows up and just gets so popular because it is so needed. NPR does a thing. It's called StoryCorps. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Yes.
Years ago, I stumbled on it. And this was when I was starting to change my mindset and get uncomfortable with the other side's opinion. And I went on the show, and they pair you up with someone who's politically different, racially different, all the things you can, all the polarization.
Yes.
And they put you together and let you talk. And it was fascinating. It was so amazing. And that's been my goal of my show, is to try to find people that maybe I'm not going to agree with on the surface, and just try to understand them, not change their mind, just find out what's in it as a first step.
That is so needed. Are you familiar with the Braver Angels organization?
Yes. Julie told me about them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Their stuff and trying to get
they're wonderful in that regard. So I think, in my journey of trying to understand what is happening to this country and what can we do about it, right? Those are the two fundamentals. So say, okay, it's great. We understand now what polarization is. We're all curious about it. We're all searching for it on Merriam-Webster. We want to understand that. Then the other question is like, and then what, right? What do we do about it? How do we start to heal these divides in a way we're also not losing our beliefs, our passions, our needs? We still should have that, right? So I don't think the solution, and I think depolarization work gets a lot of heat because it gets boiled down to, let's just all get along, right? Let's just be nicer to each other. And there's a real debate in this kind of, I think, there was a great video, and you can find it on depolarized.com, from a Carnegie Mellon researcher who's talking about the shift between political to effective polarization, but also this idea of, so you have on one side people saying, let's just promote civility initiatives. We're going to like each other more. We're going to get along. We're not going to see the worst things come to pass, like happened in Colombia, right? But then you have another side saying, but there are things wrong in this country that we need to have addressed, right? There are real valid issues about social justice or inclusion. There are real issues there about environmental policies, and how is getting along going to help? It might actually hurt pushing forward with some of these needed changes. But they make the argument, which I think is very interesting, about that win-lose kind of adversarial mindset to changing a country, changing policies. It can create a lot of blowback. And then you have that stasis where you're really not addressing the issue at all. You're addressing the sides of the issue, right? So they had a really, I think, fascinating conclusion to me, which was looking at other countries, the solution wasn't really in decreasing effective polarization or making people get along more, but it really was in having unlikely alliances where people from different sides, beliefs, started to work together to solve a problem, a common problem. And in that working together with those different passions, beliefs, needs, working together to solve a problem, that actually built more bridges than trying to promote like maybe civility, civil discourse, that kind of stuff. And you see that when you look at Braver Angels, and they're just growing by leaps and bounds, and I love that they are, because a lot of their ethos is to bring reds and blues together to talk about actual issues and really get the mindset, the ideas on the table. So in Kenosha earlier this year, I went to their convention, and you got to choose one of their debates that you were going to watch, right? Or participate in. And so the debate I chose, given also my background is in colleges and universities, was about guns and use of guns and regulations on guns. And, everybody who's in schools thinking about, how can we keep our students safe, ourselves safe in this environment. And what I loved about it was the debate, and they have debates and they have discourses that they're bringing into colleges. It was structured in a way where you really got to see each side's position, what they believed about, what was important to them, without personal attacks. But what it opened up was a real way of looking at the issue as an issue, not as a left, not as a liberal concern, or not as a right, not as a conservative concern or value, but as what's actually do we agree are the problems here, and what are the ways in which we might address them. And to see a conversation pivot in that way, when you can see, they make people wear those red bands or those blue bands, or if you're an independent, a yellow band. And when you could see people with a blue band saying, I have a concealed carry permit, I have a gun. This is what I feel is that, or people with red saying, my loved one committed suicide with a gun. So here am I. So you see their personal experiences, and it starts to disrupt that these are just two sides. Put away the sides, get to the issue, talk about some things that we could actually do in this discourse about the issue. That to me is back to what Carnegie Mellon is saying, right? Like, pick an issue and work on it together. Because now you're actually going to be able to make progress without just fighting about what side this falls on. Let's tackle the problem itself.
If I fear someone from the other camp, I am not going to listen to them. If I at least trust and respect that person, even if I may not agree, I will listen to them. And that's where I think as a base level, we need to get to. I say, be kind to people. Like, that's just weak. That's just a wussy mentality. You need to pick a side because we're at war. I'm like, yeah, we are, but we don't. If we can just at least respect each other at a minimum, then the conversation will listen. We'll want to listen more. As an example, when I shifted my political perspectives, it was right after Obama, or during the Obama, when he won the first time. And there was a guy in this, and I mention him all the time. He's like my case study, and we've been online friends for 12 years. I hated everything he said. I hated everything, but he was so articulate. I was like, I can't go toe to toe with this guy, but I hated it. And it made my guts hurt. I'm like, you suck. Mm-hmm. And I just decided I'm going to lean in and just start talking to this guy and not unfriend him. And people, multiple of my conservative friends says, why do you keep this guy around? He's such an asshole. Like, because he doesn't think like me. And I'm not threatened by that anymore. And I was for years. I'm like, I don't even want to talk to somebody who's in that other side, because if I do, then I feel like I'm caving my values and am I getting infected by their mentality? It's weird thinking, but that's where I was. So when I hear all these, I get conservative folks bashing on me now. I get more crap from my conservative friends than liberal friends because you've drank the Kool-Aid, you've been co-opted, you've been duped, and nobody wants to be duped, right?
Absolutely. And it's a very difficult thing to be tagged as leaving a tribe, right? Like there's kind of that we're probably programmed from evolutionary basis, right? You don't leave the tribe. That makes the tribe vulnerable, and so there's a threat there. Yeah, how are we strong and passionate and advocate for our beliefs and know that like conversation is not complicity, that's just because I'm having a conversation with somebody doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to absorb all their beliefs and change all my minds on everything. It's just, it's trying to understand, not necessarily trying to change anything. It's almost like we have to create a new model of what it means to be strong in this type of society, what it means to be passionate about your beliefs and your needs in the society from not a place of vulnerability, right? But from a place of actual confidence to engage. As I'm more afraid now, and I wonder if you would agree, I'm more afraid of my blind spots than I am about changing my opinions, right? I feel like my blind spots are what's going to be the biggest threat to me because I'm missing something real. I'm missing something important because I'm just not able to see it. And that I think should be more worrisome to us because I don't think people do change. And you had mentioned earlier research. I think people do change more from that basis of trust and friendship that you're talking about because they're more able to hear and process things in a non-threatening way than they do from facts. And that relationship is going to be that path to trying to find more common ground and be able to work on things together, even if you don't believe on everything the same or the approach the same, but that you're going to have that dignity, human dignity and that trust and that relationship to say, okay, why don't we both look at what we might be missing in this conversation? Because I have a perspective and you have a perspective, and maybe we find that third way together.
And our perspectives aren't some sinister plan to destroy something or someone where we think everyone has their here's an example. One of my daughters, when she lived in LA, lived near a Planned Parenthood clinic, and it was always getting protested. And we were driving by and she was just fired up, mad as hell about how she hated these people. And I said, let's go talk to them. Let's go. Wow. We didn't at that time. Because they're very, very far right Christian and she's very, very not. And I'm like, maybe go just talk to them and see why. Don't worry about changing their mind right now. I get your right, but just maybe understand. And there's a mentality like, no, I don't want to because I hate everything they stand for. I'm like, maybe what's the downside to at least talking? And I think since then she has engaged a couple of them, and of course it didn't go well.
It's hard work, right?
Together with the attitude of only trying to understand at a minimum, I think that's when the walls start breaking down if we would do that.
Yes.
And it's
not
hard.
To change the other.
It is hard. It took me a long time.
Yeah.
I didn't trust anything because all I was pounded into me was one way of thinking, and that's it. Anything else was from Satan or whoever, or the evil or whatever. Them people.
Right.
And
right.
It cripples you.
It does. And I think another really, fantastic thing I was exposed to in this Bravery Angels convention as well was the Dignity Index. So this is something we're also featuring on polarized.com, some really good work around trying to understand how our language grants or removes other people's human dignity. And so for me, I find that if we're trying to find a path away from, if I even talk to you, then I'm complicit in what you what you believe in. I'm agreeing with what you believe in just by talking to you. To like, how do we have conversations where we feel strong and secure in our beliefs, but we don't have to be aggressive or trying to change somebody's mind. We have to have that connection to just understand where people are coming from. Really focusing on never pulling back from understanding the other person has human dignity, I think is a real fundamental direction for us to pursue. I think we can disagree, and I think we can disagree passionately, as long as we don't go down that you are not human to me, right? Not that there's a very different path to say I disagree with you than you're evil, right? And that keeping that daylight between those two issues, I think really does come down to saying, I have to grant you your human dignity. You are, you have your beliefs, your, like you said, where you're raised, how you're raised, what your background is, what your experiences are. I can't invalidate all of that and just say, kind of label you as less than human. So granting people their human dignity, even in difficult conversations, because we're not going to walk away. And, I've heard Braver Angels people talk about this too. You're going to get mad. Like there's no antidote. There's no like thing to say, oh, I'm never going to get offended or I'm never going to get mad having a conversation with somebody I disagree with. But if you can stop at that level and saying they're a person, they don't have evil intent. They have their own story. My job is not to change their mind. My job is to understand and to hold on to and to test my own beliefs, right? Either I'm going to become stronger from this conversation or God forbid, my mind might be open to a different way of thinking from this conversation. But it's not, I think two things. You have to grant other people that dignity. You have to think that they're coming from a place of good intent. And I'm not saying everybody is, but when people are, grant them that understanding that they have that good intent as well.
Yeah. And being challenged helps you at a minimum understand why you hold the beliefs you do. Because I always wondered, yes, why do I believe that? Because I was just told that. Mm-hmm. And it made sense because it's confirmation bias. I don't know. Is it? And if that's the case, I don't want to I feel like I'm a puppet at that point. Yes. I'm just doing what I was told. That's just what you do,
Yep. Don't question it. Yeah. No, I think it's again, kind of going back to this idea of how do we how do we change the narrative between we're in a war, we have to pick a side, right? To, we have a perspective, we have a bias, we have a side. And let's be curious about what that other side is thinking. It can maybe dispel some of our blind spots. It can reveal for us a more effective way to address issues together where we still can get our needs met or our beliefs intact. Another really good thing that I would highlight for listeners, and they can find this link to this as well on depolarized.com, is I Never Thought About It That Way by Monica Guzman. That book is so good at trying to talk about how you live together from two completely different perspectives in relationship, right? So, she's a liberal that's lived in, in the Pacific Northwest. Her parents are immigrants from Mexico. When I met her, it was really funny in Kenosha because I said, I love listening to my nonfiction books on Audible because I can do other things. And with your book, I couldn't do anything. Like I kept just pausing and writing things down. And she said, sorry, not sorry. But it is such a great perspective in terms of thinking about values and how we just prioritize values differently. So I think another misconception is the left has its values, the right has its values. We don't share the same values, right? And that's also a path to kind of saying you're not just different than me, you're less than me. Right. But she talks about value measurement, and her father and herself did this exercise where they actually measured their affinity to certain values. And so she had like a huge, I'm going to say, autonomy, just really knocked it out of the park with autonomy. It was so important to her, that value. And when she looked at her father's, a lot of the values were kind of more even, right? Security was maybe as equal to autonomy. And so I think it's really important for us to also, when we think about values, not just necessarily assume that folks on the other political spectrum than us have completely different values, but maybe they're balancing those values in a different way. And so there is that common ground there. If we can just acknowledge that we do share values, and as Americans, we're in one culture. There's data, but I think kind of our guts can validate we have more in common from a values perspective than apart. If you looked at some of the exit polling from the most recent election, they asked people why they voted the way they did. Some of the responses were so typical. You thought you were going to see it before it came out, right? So the economy, reproductive rights was in there, other things that you think, yeah, check. But the biggest piece of the pie from both sides in the exit polls was democracy. So isn't it fascinating that we can both value tremendously the state of our democracy and vote for completely different candidates?
I wonder if when they did that poll, people's definition of democracy was the same. Because I think
That's the question.
Is it one of the famous philosophers that we always quote? I don't know who it's attributed to, Plato or one of those dudes. Mm-hmm. I think, total side note, I think those guys were the comedians of the time, like the George Carlins of their time.
Love that.
Chappelle's of their time. But he said, before entering any discussion about any topic, make sure that you both at least can agree on what that definition is. Because sometimes we talk about socialism. Oh, socialism. Jesus was a socialist. What does that mean? Person A, person B, does it mean the same thing to you both? So at least if you're going to argue about the same thing. But if you're arguing about two different things, and you're just going in circles.
Oh, and our media very much, helps us to obscure these terms. I'll tell you my suspicion, and it's also my hope. I think that Americans believe in democracy, we value it, and we see it as the same thing in terms of living in a free society where you have security and you have the ability to pursue what your goals and dreams are. And, raise a family that can do better than you did. I think that there is a commonality in what we think democracy is. I think we feel, just like we were talking about in Colombia, where the papers and the conflict entrepreneurs said, this side is destroying. No, this side is destroying. I think we're being told that the other side is destroying democracy. We both value it. We all value it. I think we all believe in it. As Americans, we culturally want a good, functioning, stable democracy. But what we think is threatening it, that's where I think the difference is. And so if we think, lack of security, lack of law and order is the biggest threat to democracy, we might vote one way. If we think that rights of minority groups, rights of disadvantaged people is the biggest threat to democracy, we might vote another way. And so I am very interested in terms of how do we capture this common love that we have as a country for what we believe in and utilize that to bridge divides in a functional way where we're actually improving. We're improving our democracy, improving our country. I would have a lot less hope if I thought we didn't both share that common goal and that common love for this country. My family does, coming from a country that lost it for a period of time. I mean, the only way to stop the violence was to go into a military dictatorship. That was how that story ended for a period of time. I think we all want to fight for the democracy in this country and for the country that we love. We're just fighting in different ways and not hearing each other about trying to improve the country itself and the actual legitimate problems that we have. So I hope it's something to build on. I hope our love for democracy is something to build on.
Well, it starts with the love of each other. I don't know if you're Christian or follow what Christ taught or anything like that, but to me, the second commandment, where love thy neighbor, I think that's the base for my existence. And that's what I try to do. If we don't have that, then nothing else matters, because we're not going to listen, even if we agree on democracy or not. If I don't care about you, so what?
That's a good point. And maybe it's knowing how to love and disagree at the same time.
And of course, our side never would do those evil things, right? It's always the other side. But stop othering people. And
yes,
I did it. I think we all do it to, we're comfortable in our tribes. And you're like, oh, you look out of your eye, corner of your eye, and look, oh, those people, they're doing some funny things. Don't really understand it. Oh, you're that. So I can put this label on you. Now I can understand you better, which in fact, I've done the opposite. After I put the label on you, I think I understand you, but I don't. And it keeps us from talking. And that's what I've realized. We just don't talk. We don't. I'm working on a book with my brother called, the title right now is just, being on the fence. And I've been accused that's weak too. That's weak. I'm like, is it weak to just see the good in wherever you can find it and not pick a team? I just don't like picking teams anymore, because again, I did that and it solved nothing and wasted a lot of my time.
I think it's brave. It's brave to be out, and not like in the coddle of your tribe, right? It's brave to be out there forging a path of trying to find a third way.
Yeah, it bites me in the butt with my family because they're like sometimes my daughter's like, Dad, I don't want to hear the other side. I don't want to be the devil's advocate. Just so my wife's like, you've got to validate them first, which I know I need to, but I suck at it. And when my one daughter fired up about something that she's bashing on conservatives and white people, my instinct is to say, maybe there's a different perspective instead of saying, that must be heartless. That must be hard to have that perspective, or that must be really scary. It's hard for me to do that. So I'm a work in progress,
Yeah, we all are.
trying to be an example of it. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I think hopefully, if we're not a work in progress, that's probably a bigger
Yeah, then
problem.
yeah, put me out of my misery because if I don't want to be, my biggest fear is staying the same.
hmm Oh, I think that's good.
Yeah.
That's really good. Hopefully, other people can follow this journey that you're on, and I feel I'm on the same way too. I've been a registered independent since I first registered to vote. Almost like I had this genetic predisposition against picking a tribe,
Yeah.
and it can be lonely sometimes,
Very,
right? It can be lonely.
but it's freeing at the same time.
At the same time, maybe we'll create a new tribe of people who aren't so readily, vulnerable to stereotyping the other side and having that partisan prejudice that one tribe or another is trying to encourage.
And fear does funny things to us. It, it just keeps you in your little cocoon. Like, oh, I don't want to step outside of this bubble because that's scary. But it's dumb because I was the model for it for so long. And even my poor wife, she was, thank you for coming to the middle, because she just tolerated my crap for years and didn't say anything, didn't ever challenge me because she didn't want to make waves in the family. And I made a lot of them, probably more than I realized. And so, yeah, we just got to start with ourselves and our neighbor. Talk to our neighbor, talk to somebody, just learn, just listen, period. No, no,
Yes.
no, no motive, no ulterior motive. No, I don't want to try to sell you on something, some idea. Just help me understand more about that.
hmm
You like blue and pink flying elephants. Tell me more about that. Instead of, you're a whack job, get off my porch.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another thing that is such an important point about the community level, right? We spend so much time and oxygen fixated on the national political scheme. With our 24-hour news cycle, it can just take all of our attention and all of our emotional energy.
And we have zero control.
But as I've told people before, none of these national politicians are going to be at your bedside when you're sick in the hospital. You know, develop the relationships you have in your family, develop the relationships in your community. Change is going to happen locally. It's going to happen on the ground. And if we could just redirect some of this angst, fear, like you said, attention economy from the national level to our communities and to our families, and start there and really start the work there. Again, not about changing minds, not about everyone agreeing, but really trying to improve that immediate sphere around us. I think, so much more progress would be made than what we're throwing at the national level and expecting us to improve our situations.
I think there's an intimidation factor also with, we all want to change the world, right? In some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fear that has to be done on such a monumental level that we think, how can one person tackle that?
Yes.
And I'm thinking, okay, that's how you change the world, by changing your world. And that's how you do it. And then that's the elephant, one bite at a time thing.
Absolutely.
I can't change what's happening in Washington, nor do I want to. Well, I lied. I do want to. I can do nothing about that. We can do nothing
Right.
about that, really, because I don't even think our vote matters anymore, honestly. Maybe it does, but part of me is like, who cares if I voted or not? It's not going to matter. But locally, you're right. I have some influence. At least know people. We can get involved. And we think we can't. We think that's not big enough, I think.
That's a really good point. And so we're directing our energies to this national level, thinking that somehow we're making more of an effect that way. It's not big enough if we're doing it locally. I think it's going to be at a real tension between this lack of faith in institutions. How are we going to reconcile for ourselves if we don't believe that we can make that impact on that ground level? Like the lack of faith in voting, the lack of faith in change in Washington. How do we make that? Can we shift that energy to the local level? One of the things that you said made me think about a really important concept that we're not talking about enough. And this is the idea of you hope you want to live in a meritocracy, right? Where the best ideas are going to prevail and the best solutions are going to prevail. And when you have kind of such an unlevel playing field, so you might say, money and politics or money on certain sides of the issues are really shutting down good discourse and good ideas to solve problems. And when we talk about, for example, with environmental policy, right? It's like, oh, there's a lot of moneyed interests that might not want environmental policy. We understand that. But on the other side, if you're going to say, well, because of that imbalance, we're not going to pursue ideas from a meritocracy standpoint anymore, but we're going to try, shame, or we're going to try harassment to get people to think a certain way. That's not going to work either, right? So how do we kind of disrupt that power structure? Everybody's looking for power. Like, how do we get power at that national level to sway things in our direction, right? And we've seen a lot of different tactics. Money is a huge one. I think shame and harassment is a huge one, like we see with cancel culture. None of that noise is getting us to a meritocracy. None of that noise is getting us to raise these solutions for a bigger level. So again, I don't know if we can disrupt these power dynamics on the national level as much as we can disrupt that at the local level and at the community level and in our families to make sure that we're doing the work of moving things forward and solving real problems versus fighting these kind of fights. Andrew Yang, I'm a big fan of him and his podcast, and he talks about incentives, right? So the incentives are all wrong at the top. Why solve a problem? Because how on earth are you going to run on that problem for your next election?
Yeah, the problem is the common enemy.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we've lost sight of, I think, in our tribe. So, part of what I think you're talking about resonates so much with me, and why I feel like Depolarize is such an important piece is we need to elevate platforms and people and books and podcasts that are saying, you don't have two tribes to pick from. We can create a third tribe. You're not alone. If you feel like I'm exhausted by these two sides, I'm exhausted by this fight that's going nowhere, I'm exhausted with problems being used as pawns for elections or other conflict entrepreneurs, and we're not getting anywhere. If you're exhausted by that and you want to step outside of that, you're not going out into the cold. There are communities out there that want to be a part of this and say, look, we're going to put our country above party. We're going to put solutions to problems above winning. And we're going to put our democracy above this kind of power dynamic that we have right now. There are other people that think like us. There are a lot of people that think like us. And what I'm hoping really is that Depolarize is that gateway for people to find this new movement, to find this new tribe, and know that you're not alone. You're not just leaving something, you're joining something.
Amen. I feel like we're maybe wrapping this up. What haven't I asked you about Depolarize and the things you're trying to do and the things that we're trying to do? We're on the same page for sure, that maybe we haven't touched on.
Absolutely. Well, I would say kind of in the spirit of what we're talking about, I just want to invite participation through depolarize.com. So come look at it and email us, contact us, say, hey, you're missing this. Or, oh my gosh, tell us if we have a bias or a blind spot. If you're from the liberal perspective and you come and you say, hey, why isn't this person represented? Or you're from a conservative perspective and you come and say, look, I don't feel like I'm represented here. Like, challenge us, challenge the resources that we're providing, and make sure that your values, the way that your perspectives are being well represented in the site. Because our goal is, again, when we're going into this new phase of not picking a side, but creating a new collective, we want to make sure that everybody is welcome there. And that's a huge goal for us on the site, that you can find your people and that you can find that without being on one side of the divide or another. I'd also love for people to share their story through the site. Like, tell me what's bringing you to this depolarization and bridge building movement. What experiences do you have, or what are you seeing in the world that worries you, that you want to say, hey, this is why I'm changing my approach, right? Maybe not my beliefs or my needs. I'm still very passionate about what I believe in, but I'm changing my approach. And so I'd love to have a lot more stories come through to us. And we've heard some great ones on social media, but keep them coming. I'm hoping to start a section of the website where people are telling their own stories about their journey to depolarization and bridge building, because we need to create a new community of like-minded individuals who are really going to drive this forward. I really do believe that we're the people we've been waiting for, not the folks we're seeing on the national stage now, but it's us.
Yeah, the clowns.
It's us.
We've chosen them. So what does that say about us?
I know. I think that says we're enculturated in a two-party system, just like Colombia was, and we're vulnerable to, partisan prejudice, and we're vulnerable to fear, and we're vulnerable to our brain's science saying, oh, I want this endorphin rush. So it's going to take a level of courage to move past this to something better.
Because if we don't, the Roman Empire, the American Empire, we could possibly go down that road if we don't change things. And I agree. I'm not trying to be extreme and fear mongering, but it didn't start. It started subtle there too, I'm sure.
Yes. I wish I could think of this gentleman's name, but there is a, I'll end on this because I think it is what you said is so salient. There is a book, and he has a video as well talking about the fall of nations. And a key component to the fall of nations, if you go back and you look at the Dutch Empire and the British Empire and the transitions of empires, a key component to the fall of a nation is internal strife. And so this is a critical moment for all of us to be a part of looking at that one facet and saying, I'm not going to contribute to that. I'm not going to contribute to the internal strife. That is a very real factor to a decline of a nation. I'm going to choose a different way. And I'm just so excited to be talking to people like you who believe the same things and are like, if we're going to fight, let's fight for that. Let's fight for that.
And you mentioned, not creating another side, but basically creating another side. I don't know if I want to do that, but creating, I don't know what you would even call it, a space. I don't know. Is that the thing? Let's create a new space, not a new side.
Yeah.
That's very
space.
us, them. I don't want a side.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe
it's good. Maybe I'm missing something. I don't know.
No, I think you're great. I think it's a movement. I think Braver Angels would call it a movement. It is a movement to reducing the strife in this country so that we can solve problems without, giving up on who we are, without becoming a monolith. We can be a continental, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. We've done it. We can do this, but it's going to take us busting out of the frame of this effective polarization and starting to really work together, even if we don't always agree.
Yes.
If my grandparents can do it, in their house every day, this conservative and liberal marriage, if they can do it, I think we can.
Yeah. I can't imagine. I've interviewed some other people that they were raised in El Salvador in the 80s in that civil war, and the things that they dealt with and the fears they had, we have no idea here. We are so blessed and soft, honestly, and we don't have these. So
privileged to be here.
I don't have to worry about getting you shot at, or somebody might unfriend me. That's about the biggest harm that's going to happen to me, which is death, really, in this world. Right?
Social death, social media death.
It's like you don't exist anymore because you were unfriended.
Oh my goodness.
Well, thank you so much, Phelosha Collaros, the founder of depolarized.com. What is an email address, or what's the best way just to go onto your site and find all the details there?
Absolutely. Or email us at info@depolarized.com. You can connect with us on social media. We're on Instagram. We're on Threads. We're on LinkedIn. Just come find us. Come join this new community and be part of this broader movement, because you're not alone. We share the same concerns. No matter what your personal identity or family identity is, we welcome you, and we want to work together to make other people feel less alone, that we're going to we're going to work toward our common value of this democracy and our love for this country. And, like you said, our love for humanity and each other at the end of the day, no matter how much we disagree, we can do that.
I use this example a lot of when I try to change and the feeling that it gives you. You remember in The Grinch? Did you see The Grinch, Jim Carrey's? At the end, when his heart was growing and it was freaking him out, and he was like, I'm leaking, because he was so happy. That's the only way I can describe when you shift to just learning about people and not trying to have an agenda. It's freeing, and I don't cry all the time, but it feels good. It feels so much better. And don't we all want that?
Absolutely. Well, my heart is a bigger size just being with you here today, Brian. So thank you so much for letting me come on and have this wonderful conversation with you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been awesome to have you. And I'll put all these details in our show notes for the listeners. Once again, thank you so much for coming on. Great having you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again for listening to The Parish the Thought Show. We know you have many podcast options and appreciate that you have chosen us. If you love what you hear, please give us a rating on whatever platform you find us. And don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. If you hate what you hear, only tell us.